My recent video following the fictitious military career of Lance Corporal Jones has led to a flurry of comments about another cast member from the classic comedy, Dad's Army. The show ran from 1968 to 1977 and followed the antics of a platoon from the Home Guard during World War II. Alongside Lance Corporal Jones, Captain Mannering, Sergeant Wilson and Private Pike is the doddery old first aider, Private Charles Godfrey, played by Arnold Ridley. In the series, his backstory from the First World War catches the platoon by surprise and earned their respect. But the real story of Arnold Ridley is even more fascinating. According to the fictitious backstory, Godfrey, who regularly asked to be excused to relieve his bladder, turns out to have been a conscientious objector during the First World War, much to the consternation of the members of the platoon. During the First World War, over 16,000 British men objected to fight for their country. Apart from social stigma of not volunteering in that initial mad rush at the outset of the war, conscientious objectors were sort of able to avoid the draft. All that changed in 1916 when conscription was introduced for the first time in British history. Now conscientious objectors were between a rock and a hard place, to serve their country or go to prison. The 1916 Military Service Act, which introduced conscription, did have a conscience clause. Any man who objected to serving had to go in front of a tribunal. And these tribunals could either give an exemption if their work was of national importance, or they could prove they'd failed the military medical. Otherwise, conscientious objectors were offered a place in the non-combat corps. Set up in 1916 on the back of the Military Service Act, specifically to deal with this situation, the men in non-combat corps would not fight. They were, however, full members of the British Army, they wore the uniform and were subject to military discipline. Most of these men were used for manual labour, digging trenches and loading and unloading supplies. Despite wearing the uniform, many fellow soldiers and the press and public were still disparaging the non-combat corps, often being referred to as the non-courage corps. However, there were another group of conscientious objectors. From the very outset of the war, there were men whose conscience wouldn't allow them to kill, but who nevertheless volunteered to serve in Britain's armed forces, especially in the Army Medical Corps. By the nature of the role they'd volunteered for, these conscientious objectors might not have fired a rifle, but as stretcher bearers, they'd both served their country and most certainly put themselves in harm's way. And Private Charles Godfrey was just such a conscientious objector who had joined the Army Medical Corps. Whilst in fiction he had volunteered for service in 1915, the fact that he admitted being a conscientious objector raised all the prejudices of the Walmington-on-Sea Home Guard platoon in Dad's Army. But the platoon was soon to change their opinion about Godfrey for the better. Firstly, the frail Godfrey bravely rescued Captain Mannering from physical danger. And next up, his sister tells the platoon of Godfrey's First World War service. He was indeed a conscientious objector, but during the Battle of the Somme, he'd gone out into no man's land to rescue wounded soldiers. Carrying them back through the mud and barbed wire to safety whilst under fire, the conscientious objector Godfrey had been awarded the Military Medal for bravery. The platoon realised that not only was the doddering old Godfrey a war hero, but he actually had a more senior medal for valour than any of them, including Lance Corporal Jones. Maybe there's a moral there about not judging books by their covers. Because whilst Godfrey is a fictional character, there were real conscientious objectors who really did rescue men from no man's land and were decorated for valour. William Coltman, a conscientious objector from Staffordshire, who, like Godfrey, joined the Army Medical Corps, became the most decorated non-commissioned officer in the British Army during the First World War, whilst never firing a shot. He is like Britain's very own World War I Hacksaw Ridge, and I'm going to tell his story very soon. Anyway, back to Dad's Army. Based upon his First World War experiences, Godfrey is given the role of platoon first aider, and appears in most episodes with a first aid satchel over his shoulder rather than carrying a rifle. And there's a good reason for that. Are you ready? Actor Arnold Ridley found it difficult to hold a rifle due to his own genuine injuries suffered in the First World War. The big difference? He was no conscientious objector. The man who played Conscientious Objector Godfrey was a genuine war hero who fought not just in the First World War, but in the Second World War too. Born in 1896 near the city of Bath in Somerset, Arnold Ridley was 72 years old when he was cast in the role of Private Charles Godfrey, MM, in 1968. Which is interesting because Godfrey's fictional character was 70 years old when he joined the Home Guard in Dad's army. Young Arnold attended the University of Bristol, where he was an accomplished sportsman, especially at rugby. Whilst his eyes were set on a career in teaching, it was also whilst at university that he took his first tentative steps at acting on stage. But any ambitions for either teaching, acting or sport were put on hold on the 4th of August 1914, when Britain entered the First World War. Unlike the conscientious objectors, Ridley had no hesitation in volunteering. He joined those famous crowds of young men lining up outside town halls and recruiting depots across Britain. Young, clever, athletic, an ideal candidate for Kitchener's Citizens' Army. And then came the medical examination, and a cruel twist of fate. Rugby-playing Ridley was carrying a sporting injury, a hammer toe, picked up in a match. With hundreds of thousands of young men to pick from, the army of 1914 could be choosy about whom they accepted. And they didn't need Ridley. And so, he ended up in a teaching career after all. But our story doesn't end there. Far from it. Still desperate to fight for his country, Ridley tried his luck a year later. By late 1915, the casualty rate on the Western Front now meant that the army were no longer as picky as they had been in those enthusiastic weeks following the outbreak of war. Ridley, plus his hammer toe, entered the British Army as a private in the Somerset Light Infantry. In early 1916 he arrived at Arras on the Western Front, but just 2 days after his arrival he was hit in the back by shrapnel and ended up in hospital. Rejoining the regiment, he was promoted to Lance Corporal in time for the Battle of the Somme, and it was here that Ridley suffered horrific injuries. In an attack, his regiment reached the German lines and Ridley was involved in hand-to-hand fighting. As he jumped into the enemy trench, a German soldier hit him on the head with the butt of his rifle. Fortunately, Ridley was wearing his helmet, but the force of the blow would give him reoccurring blackouts afterwards. Another German soldier charged him with a bayonet. He managed to parry the bayonet thrust away from his chest, but merely pushed it down into his groin instead. He parried a second thrust, this time deflecting the blade into his left hand, cutting the tendons. He would never properly use 3 fingers on his left hand ever again. Which brings us back to Dad's army and his character, Private Godfrey. Many of you might remember Godfrey advancing hesitantly with his rifle in the closing credits of each episode. Yet for most of the time as the platoon first aider, Godfrey tended to merely carry a first aid satchel over his shoulder rather than a gun. And this was very deliberate from the producers. It meant that Arnold Ridley, by now in his 70s, didn't have to use his left hand to carry a rifle. Anyway, back to the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Having suffered a blow to the head and 2 bayonet wounds, Ridley was then hit in the legs by shrapnel. Once more invalided home, when he recovered, he appeared in front of an army medical board to be assessed as to whether he should be discharged. One member of the board looked at his damaged left hand and queried whether Ridley had inflicted the wound on himself. With a good dose of sarcasm, Ridley responded, "Yes, sir, my battalion is famous for self-inflicted wounds, and just to make sure, I cracked my skull with a rifle butt as well, and ran a bayonet into my groin." It seems that sometimes sarcasm works, for Ridley convinced the medical board his injuries were genuine and that he was in no fit state to continue to fight. In 1917, he was discharged. His wartime service was very different to conscientious objector Private Godfrey. And yet, one incident about his discharge binds them together. Men who had been discharged from the army on medical grounds were given a discharge badge to wear on their jacket to prove that they'd served their country and weren't shirking. Ridley didn't like drawing attention to himself as injured, so he kept it in his pocket. One day, as Ridley was walking down the road in his civvies, a woman came up to him and presented him with a white feather for being a coward. After the war, Arnold Ridley had a short career as an actor before becoming a playwright. In total, he wrote 30 plays, the most famous of which was The Ghost Train, written in 1923. It was to run for over 600 consecutive showings in London's West End, and was made into a film on 3 occasions. In 1939, the UK entered the Second World War. With his experiences of the First World War, and now in his 40s, no one could begrudge Arnold Ridley if he argued that he'd already done his bit for his country. But that was not Ridley. He immediately re-enlisted. For this war, he was commissioned as an officer, with the temporary rank of Major. He was sent to France to join the BEF during the Phoney War, that period between war being declared and Hitler finally unleashing his blitzkrieg in the West. During those long, arguably tedious months, Ridley was what was called a conducting officer, supervising visiting journalists. The latter always complained that the conducting officers treated them like spies, which, well, they might. After all, the visiting journalist from the Times was none other than infamous Soviet agent Kim Philby. On the 10th of May 1940, after 8 months of waiting, the Germans finally struck. In their famous lightning campaign, they smashed through the Allied lines, pushing for the English Channel. Ridley was part of the British army that fell back on the port of Boulogne. Once more he was wounded as the British and their French allies fought with their backs to the Channel. On the 24th of May, Ridley was one of 1,400 men evacuated on board HMS Wimerra. The old World War I destroyer was so laden down with troops, there were concerns that she'd be grounded in the harbour. Fortunately, that wasn't the case, and having survived Luftwaffe attacks, HMS Wimerra, complete with Arnold Ridley, arrived back in Dover later that day. A week later, Ridley was once more discharged from the army on medical grounds. Considering the role that he was to play in Dad's army, it's somewhat appropriate that he joined his local Home Guard unit. As the war progressed, he joined the Entertainment's National Service Association, ENSA. This organisation, established in 1939, provided entertainment to members of the British Armed Forces throughout the war. It featured some of the biggest names in British showbiz at the time, including Vera Lynn, Gracie Fields and George Formby. Here, he combined his acting and playwriting talents. After the war, he reverted to acting rather than playwriting. He appeared as the village baker, Dowie Hood, in The Archers, before landing his role in Dad's Army in 1968. And as Private Godfrey, he stayed with the show through all 9 series, lasting from 1968 to 1977. By the time the curtain closed on the show, he was 81. Arnold Ridley died in 1984, aged 88, and is buried at the Abbey in his native city of Bath. It's humbling to realise that the man known to so many of us as a doddering old fool in Dad's army was actually a veteran from both world wars and had sustained serious injuries serving his country. It is also interesting that he was willing to play the role of a conscientious objector when he was far from one himself. Maybe, having both seen the horrors of the First World War and possibly treated by a stretcher bearer who may very well have been a conscientious objector for all we know, he could appreciate the bravery of their actions as well as the sincerity of their beliefs. And as for Private Godfrey, MM, his character shows that if ever there was a case, you really shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Especially when there were real conscientious objectors who did serve their country with huge bravery. Well, thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, then click the like button or indeed join my supporters club. More videos on their way, including the Red River Expedition, the Ashanti Wars and the Indian Mutiny, not forgetting William Coltsman, the World War I conscientious objector who ended up getting more medals for bravery than all the men firing weapons. But until then, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.